Handheld gaming has been a popular choice for gamers in recent decades, whether it's getting a quick game of Metro Simulator in on the way home from work, or a playthrough of Dream Daddy during a boring family event. Handhelds are often associated with the more casual gamer. Sure, there are people that play 6,000 hours of Animal Crossing in bed, but most lengthy gaming sessions are set in front of a monitor or TV screen. With an industry that has been dominated by a single company for so long, many developers have jumped ship to join the mammoth, money-making monopoly of the mobile market. However, handhelds have a much better reputation than their mobile counterpart, but the revenue difference is shocking. Whilst the handheld gaming console has been around for almost half a century now, the future didn't always look bright for the industry. But with Nintendo almost single-handedly dragging handhelds into the current generation, handheld gaming has maintained its place as gaming's favourable younger brother. From flashing and beeping LED lights to some of the world's most powerful portable computers, the history of handheld gaming has been an interesting one, constantly operating parallel to home consoles. Handheld gaming has carved a path of its own, ever since Michael Katz dreamt of playing an electronic game on his Casio calculator. 1975. The Mattel company was currently $118 million in debt, and their Barbie world was crumbling around them. The founders, Ruth and Elliot Handler, had been found to have been issuing financial statements that were deliberately false and misleading.
It was a simple mistake. It could happen to anyone.
Not too long ago, they were the hottest glamour stock on Wall Street, but after the success of the Barbie doll and Hot Wheels had died down, Mattel tried cooking the books to keep that Barbie party rolling on. After settling 5 class action lawsuits out of court, Ruth and Elliot Handler graciously stepped away from the company, and Arthur Spear took over the role as president of Mattel Inc. It was his job to get microplastics back inside every little boy and girl's home in America, to pull them out of this hole and reinstate them as the biggest toy company in the world. Mattel went on a hiring spree to help bring new life into the company, and one of those new recruits was a marketing executive, Michael Katz. Katz was given the task to explore new product categories and introduce products in areas where the company had not previously been successful. Katz had an idea of creating a calculator-sized electronic game using LEDs and asked head of electronic department Richard Chang to look into it. Modifying calculators into games wasn't a completely new idea at the time. Texas Instruments' Little Professor and Unisonic's Casino 7 had both released calculators in 1976 that could play simple math games on them. But repurposing a calculator chip to create something new, that was an original idea. Richard Chang began to flesh out the idea with his team, and he and George Close designed an LED obstacle avoidance game. They approached Rockwell International, a conglomerate with a chip design operation, to create the idea they had in mind.
Rockwell International, where science gets down to business.
And Mark Lesser, an engineer at the company looking for a new project, jumped on the idea. Limited to only 511 bytes of code, Mark was able to reprogram a calculator to have LED lights reacting to each other on the screen. Chang worked with graphic designer David James to set up themes that the light game could be based on, and came up with several activities including baseball, racing, and football. They showed off auto race and football at the 1976 Consumer Electronics Show, but no one really seemed to care.
I don't give a damn.
Mattel had never been successful in video games, and consumers were skeptical. They attended a second Consumer Electronics Show in June. This time they brought auto race, football, and missile attack. But people were still uninterested. Fortunately, Mattel were able to secure parts for 500,000 units to be made, and Auto Race was released on May 1977. Mattel was excited to share with the world their new computer toy, and also make lots and lots of money. But initial sales numbers were not good. In a panic, Mattel quickly prepared for their second release, and released Football in September, preparing for a massive fall advertising campaign.
From Mattel Electronics.
And in November, they released Missile Attack. But there was a problem. NBC Television Network refused to air any of the commercials that featured Missile Attack. They were worried that it may cause children to think New York City would actually be blown up if they lost the game. Thinking quickly, Mattel decided to pull it from shelves, trying to control the problem. But then, Sears cut back on orders, halting production of 100,000 units, making Auto Race and Football difficult toys to find by Christmas. This was a disastrous release for Mattel. They felt like they had an innovative, fun toy that the world would never see, and it would fall into obscurity with Mattel's other failed projects. But by January, all 100,000 units had been sold, and Sears wanted more.
I need more.
Mattel fired up the factory again, and production restarted. Sears were now asking for 200,000 units a week, and by February, they were selling 500,000 units every week. Mattel was back in business, and they were trying to produce electronic games to keep up with the demand. And that year, they released basketball, baseball, soccer, and hockey, all selling millions of copies. Seeing the success of Mattel's electronic games, Coleco jumped into the scene. They released their own football game that included several more features than Mattel's.
I got 7 men on defense.
7? I've only got 5.
I can even pass.
I can't pass.
My receiver runs short, long, any pattern.
Pattern? I don't even have a receiver.
Or I can score a safety.
Safety?
Coleco took their new console to Sears to see if they were interested in funding the production. But during a demonstration, an executive tripped and fell and broke it,
I bent my walkie,
causing Sears to decline to buy it. Coleco instead released the game themselves, and it was released in 1978 and sold over 3 million copies. But Mattel were pissed.
I can set the building on fire.
They filed a lawsuit against Coleco, claiming they had violated their patents. But Mattel's lawyers weren't as experienced as Coleco's, and eventually the case was dropped. The handheld console wars had begun. After the success of Mattel's and Coleco's games, many other inventive toy developers strangely had similar ideas, and a number of handheld consoles were released over the following years. The Parker brothers released a tic-tac-toe game dubbed Merlin in 1978, and the Milton Bradley Company released Microvision the following year that was the first to incorporate the game cartridge-based system that was capable of playing multiple games. 1980, Japan. Gunpei Yokoi was riding the bullet train home from a day of work when he noticed the bored businessman next to him fiddling with his pocket calculator for entertainment. Yokoi wondered if he could create something similar and transform a simple calculator into a portable entertainment game. An idea that had never been thought of since Mattel's Auto Race. The next day, he had to drive his boss downtown for a meeting, and he pitched the idea. If we can make a game machine as small and thin as a calculator, salarymen can play games without getting busted, Yokoi said. His boss was Hiroshi Yamauchi, president of Nintendo. Yamauchi didn't show much interest in the idea, and Yokoi thought it was a bust. A week later, Yamauchi called Yokoi into his office, and an executive for the electronic company Sharp was there to meet him. Coincidentally, the meeting that Yokoi had driven Yamauchi to the week earlier was with Akira Saiki, the president of Sharp, the world's biggest calculator manufacturer, and they had discussed Yokoi's idea. Nintendo and Sharp, much like Mattel and Rockwell International, worked together to produce a calculator-sized gaming device, a single game and a clock that always showed the time. Maybe we could call it Playing Clock, or Fun Time. And on April 28, 1980,
Game Watch!
Ball was released for Game & Watch. It was a simple game that had a player juggling balls, but that wasn't the end. By the end of the year, Nintendo had released 5 Game & Watch consoles, all with different games to play. Then the next year, they released 10. And over the next 10 years, Nintendo pumped out around 50 different Game & Watch consoles, selling 43 million units worldwide, with the Donkey Kong game being the first ever console to include the D-pad design still used today. Yokoi's idea would make Nintendo billions. But before that could happen, on the 21st of April 1989, Yokoi's next project was released.
Introducing Game Boy. It's portable, it's in stereo, and its games are interchangeable. Game Boy comes complete with batteries and the outrageous new game Tetris. And for head-to-head competition, use Video Link and blow your opponent away. Game Boy.
The Nintendo Game Boy.
This is an emergency Nintendo news flash.
The cartridges are the key because you can change games.
With the Nintendo Game Boy, pocket size.
Some things you'll need to know about the Game Boy
first
itself.
portable gaming device.
The name Nintendo is familiar to everybody who plays video games because they're very popular
Game Boy.
now.
It is the video game craze, the Nintendo craze.
With the console not tied to one game, consumers could all buy the same console and then pick and choose on what games to buy, freeing up Nintendo to produce more games and save money on console hardware. During production though, there was a lot of infighting at Nintendo. As head of development team, Yokoi didn't like the idea of creating a portable video game. He was more focused on making toys. He was a toy maker at heart, and this old toy maker's heart didn't like the direction Nintendo was heading. So he blocked production as much as possible, trying to change many aspects of the console, keeping it in line with previous products of the company. But eventually, Yokoi lost the battle and agreed to help develop the Game Boy. 5 months later, Atari released the Lynx on the 1st of September 1989 to a positive reception.
You gonna buy the same old game, boy?
Atari Lynx, the portable video arcade. It'll blow you away. Lynx, more fun and games from Atari.
Then, a year later, the Sega Game Gear and NEC's Turbo Express were released. All of the consoles sold quite well at the time, but the Nintendo Game Boy completely trounced all of them. Despite being technologically inferior to all of them, the Game Boy sold 8 times as many consoles than all of them combined. The Game Boy was cheaper, had a longer battery life, and more games than its competitors. And so began Nintendo's long dominance over the handheld market. In 1996, Gunpei Yokoi decided to leave Nintendo after 31 years at the company. Having transitioned from a toy company to a cutting-edge computer company, Nintendo wasn't the same place as when he first arrived. He decided to form his own gaming company called Koto Laboratory that would focus more on Game & Watch style consoles, and he left, taking some like-minded Game Boy developers with him. But not long after leaving Nintendo, the company Bandai asked Yokoi and his team to help them with their latest handheld console to try and compete against the Game Boy, the very console that he had created back in 1989. The news of this collaboration terrified Nintendo. Yokoi had left with a vast knowledge of the Game Boy, and if anyone could outsell the Game Boy, it would be its creator. But only a year after leaving Nintendo, Yokoi was hit by a car and was fatally injured, passing away on the 4th of October 1997 at the age of 56, and Koto Laboratory had only released 2 games at the time of his passing. In 1998, Nintendo released the Game Boy Color, beating even Bandai's new product to launch, and completely dominating the handheld market, making its only competitor the original Game Boy. It featured a color screen, a wide range of console colors with a sleek design and an all-around upgrade to the original. Releasing alongside Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow, the Game Boy Color could never fail, and it sold almost 50 million units. And today, the Game Boy is the 3rd best-selling console of all time. On March 4th, 1999, Yokoi's final project was released.
Wonder Swan!
The Bandai Wonder Swan, only releasing in Japan for 4,800 yen. Whilst it wasn't the Game Boy killer that Yokoi had set out to build, it did manage to sell 1.5 million units during its run and was able to capture up to 8% of the handheld market at the time, becoming the 2nd most popular handheld in Japan. But still being behind the Game Boy Color, Bandai announced that it would be bringing a colored version of the console very soon. One of the launch titles of the Wonder Swan was a Tetris-like game that had been taken from one of Koto Laboratory's keychain games, Heno Heno. They renamed the game to Gunpei as a tribute to the late Gunpei Yokoi. A year later, the colored version came out. Surprisingly, it had a colored screen and was slightly larger than the original, and it was backwards compatible as well. The Color managed to sell just over 1 million copies and convinced Bandai to work on a follow-up console, and the Swan Crystal was released in 2002, but it was competing against Nintendo's newest console at the time, and it couldn't match. It sold 850,000 units in its lifetime, and all of the Game Swan consoles were discontinued a year later. By now, the gaming console market was dominated by Japan. Nintendo, Bandai, SNK, Sony, and Sega all had successful platforms on the market, and Korea was looking on in envy, and South Korea even more so. Ever since the Japanese overstayed their welcome till 1945, Korea had put in place many laws preventing Japanese media and technology entering their country, and one of those laws restricted consoles and games from Japan. Obviously they used loopholes to get systems in, and had clones of all the major consoles at the time, but the embargoes heavily limited the number of consoles in the country, and pushed Korean gamers into playing games on their computers. The media would also add to this by claiming that Japanese video games caused photosensitive epileptic seizures, causing the public to be even more hesitant in having video game consoles in their homes. But with all the money these Japanese consoles were making, the Korean government wanted one.
국가적으로 매우 불행하고 부끄러운 일입니다. 그러나 이러한 과정을 거치지 않으면 우리 역사는 바로 설 수 없습니다.
In 1996, they set up a contest to find a company that could create an all-Korean console that could upset the monopoly that is Nintendo. The winning company was Game Park, and using taxpayers' money, they were tasked in making the first handheld console for Korea. It took them 4 years, but by the end of 2001, they were finally ready to release the GP32. More powerful than Nintendo's Game Boy Advance, open source to help create an influx of third-party games and a whole nation to themselves to sell it to.
휴대용 게임기는 청소년들 사이 인기 품목입니다. 그런데 일본 업체가 독점해왔던 휴대용 게임기 시장에 한 국내 벤처기업이 도전장을 내밀었습니다. 이주상 기자입니다.
But only 38 days after its release, Korea lifted the ban on Japanese technology entering the country. A 56-year-old ban lifted overnight, and the second Japanese invasion began. Unfortunately, due to the popularity of the Game Boy Advance,
only for Game Boy Advance,
only 28 commercial games were ever released for the console, and in its lifetime, only 30,000 GP32s were sold. Game Park began production on their second console in 2005, but due to a disagreement within the company about the direction the console was going, many of the staff left the company, forming their own, calling it Game Park Holdings, and they released their first console soon after. The GP2X was released in Korea to a small success. They sold 60,000 units, double that of the previous console. It was the spiritual successor to the GP32, and it was also open source, and many people bought the console for its multimedia functions, including a large number of emulated games, television docking, movies, music, ebooks, and an English learning tool. They also released a second version of the console that featured a touchscreen and stylus. The original Game Park company was still trying to release their second console during this time, the XGP, but during production, the company ended up filing for bankruptcy and the console was never released. Not too sure how a government-funded company can go bankrupt after most of its employees and technology start a new company with essentially the same name and product. But anyway, in 2009, the Korean president Lee Myung-bak came out and said,
여러분 이거 다 거짓말인 걸 아시죠? 여러분 언제부터 한 방에 간다 그러더니 그 한 방에 어디 갔습니까?
Unfortunately for Game Park Holdings, they were just about to release their second console, the GP2X Wiz, and it was quickly dubbed the Myeongtendo by many Koreans, mocking the president's silly statements, but unfortunately caused others to think it was a rust project based off of the president's idea. A year later, they released their final console, the GP2X Qumu. Both of these consoles were received moderately well. They were the only handheld consoles at the time that were Linux-based and open source, creating an interest in the console long after it was discontinued. But after the Qumu, Game Park Holdings stopped making consoles and focused solely on software. Nintendo has been the most dominant force in the market for the last 20 years. So much so that other companies weren't even trying to compete anymore, and it would have to take someone big to try and take them on. And in 2003, Sony announced that they would be stepping up to the plate. They had already proved themselves a few years earlier when the PlayStation 2 dominated the Nintendo GameCube, so Nintendo knew that they were up for a fight. In 1999, Sony had tested the handheld waters with their Pocket Station, a PlayStation memory card that doubled as a small handheld device. Initially, they only released 60,000 units in Japan, not realizing how successful it would be. But over its 3.5-year life cycle, Sony sold just under 5 million units of the Pocket Station, and now they were back, with a full-fledged handheld console ready to take it to Nintendo. Nintendo had just released the Nintendo DS in November 2014 to an astounding success. But just 2 weeks later, the PlayStation Portable was released. Both were technical marvels at the time, but also very different from each other. Sony had followed the success of the PlayStation 2 with state-of-the-art graphics and top-of-the-line technology, making it the most powerful handheld console ever released. Nintendo, however, featured dual screens with one located between the controls that was also a touchscreen, and both featured wireless and online multiplayer, making online gaming a necessity in the future. Comparing their first weeks on the market together, Nintendo had the lead, coming first in the United States and Japan, but the PSP was right behind them, taking first place in Europe. And for 2 years, Sony chased Nintendo. Some months selling more, others less. But in March 2006, Nintendo released the DS Lite.
It's white, it's bright, it's the DS Lite.
A cheaper basic version of the console, and that's when Nintendo started to pull away. PlayStation didn't respond for almost a year, and by the time they released the PSP Slim, the DS Lite had sold more units than the original PSP. Sony was now on the back foot, and the PSP Slim never sold as well as the original. A year later, they released the PSP Slim and Lite, an even more refined version of the console. But whatever they tried, they couldn't catch up to Nintendo. Only 2 weeks after the release of the Slim and Lite, Nintendo released the DSi. The DSi was released to be an individual person's console, customizing it to the user's preference. Sony released the PSP Go a year later that was a complete redesign of the console. It was more than 50% smaller than the original, and got away with the disc drive. A month later, Nintendo released the DSi XL, a bigger version of the console, then the 3DS, then Sony's PSP Street, then the PS Vita, then the 3DS XL, 2DS, new 3DS XL, new 3DS, new 2DS XL. Nintendo had won. Again. Sony had put up a fight, but they just couldn't keep up. The original 3DS outsold the PS Vita 3-1, but Nintendo didn't step off the gas. They brought out 6 iterations of the 3DS before finally discontinuing the console. Sony, however, had already thrown in the towel. They switched their focus to mobile gaming and producing software for app stores. In 2022, they announced the Backbone 1 PlayStation Edition, an exoskeleton controller for your phone in the shape of a PlayStation controller that lets you remotely play your PlayStation games through your phone. Even today, Nintendo still sits on top. They continued through the 2010s without any serious competitors, and ruled over the market with the Nintendo 3DS. And now, with the success of their hybrid Nintendo Switch, the rise in mobile gaming hasn't killed the handheld console business, and Nintendo will probably continue to dominate the market far into the future, pushing portable gaming further than anyone back in the early 80s could have predicted. With Nintendo's expected place at the top of the market, companies more recently have realized that there is still a large audience to capture without attempting to snatch Nintendo's crown. In 2022, Valve released their long-awaited Steam Deck, the company behind the largest PC gaming store and launcher on the internet, releasing with thousands of games already in its catalog. But not just letting users play games from their store, as it also can be used as a functioning computer, and any game store platform can be downloaded and games purchased from the Steam Deck. Looking back at the modified calculators of the 70s to the pocket-sized gaming computers like the Valve Steam Deck, the handheld gaming community has become just as important as the home console. Older portable consoles have become highly sought after for collectors and retro gamers alike, creating a higher value for consoles that didn't sell many at launch and are rare and expensive today. Companies have started re-releasing their old consoles with today's technology, packaging all their games into one system. Other, less prominent companies will package any popular game over the last 40 years into a cheap console and resell emulated versions of games that are hard to find anymore. Overall, portable gaming has changed dramatically over the years, and even if on the outside they just look like a bigger version of the past, the technology inside is incomparable. And as long as Nintendo remains profitable in the industry, it'll be a long time before we see an end to the portable gaming console.